Hello, I'm Sarah Ellis, and this is the Squiggly Careers Ask the Expert podcast series. Each week we focus on a skill that we think is particularly relevant at work right now and interview an expert from around the world about how we can develop these skills for ourselves. This episode is the final in our first series, and I talked to the amazing Amy Edmondson. She's a Harvard professor whose work really concentrates on something called psychological safety. We'd love to know whether you'd like to hear a second series, and if you would, which skills and guests would be on your wish list. You can get in touch with us on Instagram, where we're at AmazingIf, or just email us helenandsarah@amazingif.com. And if you've enjoyed the series, a rate, review, subscribe, share would all be brilliant. They make a massive difference. We read them all, and honestly, it's the best part of our week. Our Ask the Expert series is supported by the Bupa UK Foundation. They're a charity whose purpose is to help people live longer, healthier, happier lives. They fund practical projects which have a positive impact on people's mental well-being, including wellbeing workshops for educators, working with Mind to empower better mental health in young people through online resources, and funding community mental wellbeing projects. I really hope you enjoy listening to today's episode, and I'll be back at the end to let you know what's coming next and how you can get in touch with us. Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Amy, perhaps for our listeners who are new to the idea of psychological safety, or have perhaps heard about it, but maybe don't have lots of knowledge about exactly what it means in a work context, perhaps you could just start by describing for us what it is and why it matters at work.
Psychological safety is a belief that I can bring my full self to work, right? It's a belief that I can speak up candidly with what I see, with my ideas, with my concerns, and even with my mistakes. I think the biggest reason that psychological safety matters is that if people are not able to speak up, you are at risk for preventable failures and for failures of innovation. So there's really the preventing the bad and the not realizing the good aspects of this. So there are countless case studies whereby employees in companies had strong ideas about risks and worries, and they got the message loud and clear that those above them didn't want to hear from them. And the business failures are many and famous. Similarly, without the ability to speak up, you've got people not sharing their ideas, not teaming up to kind of come up with new things to innovate. So no company can afford to have preventable failures or a lack of innovation. And psychological safety is critical to both.
And it's so interesting because as you describe both of those things, it makes complete sense, and rationally, I would imagine every leader should be nodding their head thinking, of course, we want to make sure that we anticipate preventable failures. I would imagine most people would recognise that all of the wisdom doesn't sit with the people who are the most senior in an organisation. But from everything I've read, certainly achieving psychological safety is tough. It's difficult because it requires often organisations to maybe shift the way that they think and individuals to maybe think in a new way. What do you observe typically kind of gets in the way of something that I think we would all hope that organisations would work with lots of psychological safety?
You said that so well. It's like people intellectually or rationally recognize that, of course, I want and need to hear from my employees. But what they don't recognize is that an act of not speaking up is invisible, meaning that you can't know, in the moment, you can't know if someone had a great idea that they didn't share. It's just not, written across their forehead. You can't know if someone had a concern about a potential threat to the business that they didn't share. Again, it's invisible. And so there's this real asymmetry about speaking up. When someone speaks up and let's say it's not well received, that creates a lasting impression that's, largely bad for the person who spoke up. Whereas when they didn't speak up, no one around or above them is the wiser. They don't know it happened. And the person just skates by another moment without harm. So that's a tremendous asymmetry. And that's, of course, what makes this so tricky. And I would go so far as to say that's why psychological safety, even though it's obvious you would want it, why it still remains not the norm.
And do you think then, thinking about what you just described around the leaders don't know what they don't know because it's not very visible, does that then mean when you see organisations or team leaders who are doing this really well, is role modelling particularly important? Because I would imagine you talked about consequences being really memorable. So if you do speak up, or if you do make a mistake, or if you perhaps talk to your leader about a risk and it isn't well received, you kind of really feel the negative consequences. But if actually those behaviours are both encouraged, and then when they do happen, people see lots and lots of examples of that being very positively received, does that have like a knock-on effect, almost like a virtuous cycle of the more this happens, the more it encourages it? Do those two things correlate?
Yes, absolutely. And it's role modeling is the critical concept, I think. If you want others to engage in a behavior, say openness, say curiosity, learning, courage, you've got to do the same things. And mission critical is responding in what I call a productive way to, say, bad
Yeah.
news. So if someone brings you something that, your instinct would be to not receive it well. I mean, your instinct would be to be frustrated or negative in some way. You have to override instinct and instead say something like, thanks for bringing that up, right? That isn't the same as saying, hey, I agree with you, or hey, that's brilliant, because you don't believe that. And I don't believe in being disingenuous, but you do have to acknowledge and appreciate that someone brought something that they thought was relevant. So it's thanks for bringing that up. And maybe something next along the lines of, here's how I'm looking at it, right? Leaders have a primary responsibility to develop, educate others, but I may be missing something, right? And so there's always you're role modeling a learning stance, because a learning stance is essentially the only wise stance in a changing world.
And do you think that requires leaders to become more comfortable with being vulnerable? Because as I was listening to you describe those behaviours, it moves us away from a kind of the more hierarchical command and control world, where the idea was the more senior you were, perhaps the expectation, maybe from others, but perhaps particularly of yourself, was that you were meant to be the ones that kind of knew the answers, to actually being very open to everybody has something to contribute. All of the knowledge doesn't sit with one person. And actually that's seen as a positive, as a sign of confident leadership, to show that vulnerability, to say, I'm really interested in that point of view. It's not something I'd heard before, or it's not something that I'd anticipated.
I could not have said it better myself. I mean, that's spot on. And I think the less sophisticated, less wise leader fails to recognize that vulnerability is a strength, which sounds like an oxymoron, but it isn't.
Yeah.
It's only when you're strong enough and confident enough to be vulnerable that you really are, aware of reality, in a sense, because we're all vulnerable. That's just a given. We're vulnerable to the next thing that's coming around the corner. We don't have a crystal ball. We're vulnerable to not knowing things that aren't in our domain of expertise. And so being wise enough to model that vulnerability is just a brilliant way to help others do the same.
And you spend time both kind of with lots of organisations and kind of teaching psychological safety. What do you observe, and what kind of insights have you gained through your work? Because it's an area that you have looked at and been kind of really in the kind of detail of, and kind of developed this expertise of over actually a long period of time. As you say, it's not something that, this is not easy. I think we all kind of recognise this. So what are people or leaders doing particularly well, do you think, where if you have accepted the rational argument and you understand, I think a lot of this is about kind of mindset and behaviours, there's then still that kind of piece around action. What can organisations do? What can a leader do? What kind of actions do you see people taking where they increase the psychological safety of their teams or their organisations?
Well, I think the most important thing is being open and continuously reminding people about the nature of the challenges we face. Right? So, psychological safety and transparency go hand in hand. I mean, they're not synonymous, but psychological safety is describes a context where transparency is possible. And let's be clear, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy or it's going to be fun or everything we say is going to receive applause or, be in wild agreement with each other. We're not. In fact, quite the opposite. What leaders must do is what I call frame the work. So, what's the work that we do? Let's say we're working on developing new products in our company that will delight customers. So we're constantly saying, hey, this is the kind of work for which, failures along the way are quite literally mission critical for success. Right. So now intellectually, anyone who works on innovation projects understands that. But emotionally, it's still hard. Each and every one of us prefer success to failure. So the leader is framing the work, saying we need to take those risks. We need to experiment. It's not always going to work out. Now, you might think, oh, I could say that once and I'm done. Not so. It has to be said over and over and over to keep overriding those instincts that lead us human beings to want to look good or to get it right the first time or to be perfect, however you want to put it. So it's really just continually calling attention to the messy, challenging, wonderful reality that we're up against.
I was thinking about which aspect or dimension of psychological safety do I find the hardest? And for me personally, it's about making mistakes. I was the kid at school who I only liked to put my hand up if I was 100% confident that I got the answer right. I've spent a lot of time in very large corporates where, the word mistake wasn't used particularly frequently. And it certainly wasn't something that I saw role modelled very often.
Right.
And so as I moved into more senior leadership positions, it was really something that I had to learn. I had to learn that it was okay to make a mistake. And actually, if anything, it was really important that I learned to talk to my teams about the mistakes that I was making, because if I didn't do that, they wouldn't talk to me about their mistakes.
Right.
And actually
and then you'll be blindsided, right? Then.
Of course. And I think if you're expecting behaviours of other people, it obviously kind of has to start with yourself. And I think it's okay to say to people, and I find this hard. The critical point for me, or the bit I think that really helped it to click in terms of, sometimes forcing yourself out of your comfort zone into what we often call kind of the courage zone, because I think some of this stuff you have to be quite courageous in your leadership, was actually thinking about what are the consequences if I don't do this. So for me, it was, I really don't like making mistakes, but actually the consequences are that then I'm not giving other people the opportunity to help me solve it quicker. Other people might have some really good answers here to contribute. And actually I'm being quite selfish in terms of keeping this to myself and maybe trying to hide that mistake or squirrel away and fix it. And so I think thinking through consequences certainly was a useful technique for me to just push me in those areas that I found particularly difficult.
Exactly right. In a sense, you're trying to sell yourself, right, on doing something hard. And no one would ever buy anything if they didn't see some value in it. And so you're sort of reminding yourself that even though this might be hard and feel like it costs something of me right now emotionally, it's worth it. That the value I will get from it will pay for the cost and then some. And the reason why, as you describe it, you have to keep reminding yourself is because you will keep going back to your instincts. And instincts are, to be that little kid who only raises her hand when she's 100% sure she's going to get it right. Which, by the way, I think of psychological safety as lowering that percentile, right? So if I'm not saying you should raise your hand when you have 0% likelihood of getting it right. That would that would waste people's time. I'm not going to give you an exact number, but most people in most organizations have put the threshold too high. And even if it's not at 100, maybe it's at 90 or 85. And, they'll speak up. Of course they will when they're 85% sure that what they have to say is going to be well received. But anything below that, they won't. Well, psychological safety is about lowering that threshold to a healthy level where, we'll get it wrong sometimes. That's fine. We won't be wasting tons and tons of times on things we haven't thought about at all. But we won't confuse interpersonal risk with business risk. But, interpersonal risks just don't matter as much as our brains tell us they do. Whereas, business risks and human safety risks do matter. And I can't tell you how many. I guess I have about 20 different case studies in the book, maybe 10 of which are companies where, because people weren't willing to take interpersonal risk, the companies ended up with, abysmal business risk that were preventable.
Yeah, and I think that's where it starts to get really compelling. I think when I've read some of those case studies in the book, I just thought, crikey, if you weren't convinced before, you certainly are then. I'm interested in the current environment where the world has changed very quickly and individuals, leaders, and organisations are all having to adapt and innovate pretty quickly to respond to kind of where we are. I almost can't think of a more important, almost environment where we need that psychological safety, because actually more than ever we're going to need people's ideas, we're going to need to prevent risks, we're going to need to support businesses to survive, to recover, after what will have been an incredibly tough time. Can you almost start to see organizations really thinking about this already, or is it a bit too soon?
I think they are thinking about it. In fact, many have been reaching out. So organizations are thinking about this. It's not as straightforward as it first sounds, right? Because psychological safety is indeed an absence of a certain kind of fear, but it's not an absence of all fear. And so I like to make a distinction between interpersonal fear, where I'm primarily worried about what you'll think of me if I say something stupid, and let's say COVID related fear, which is, a very sensible fear of a dangerous virus. And the good news, if you can find any good news, the good news about COVID related fear is that it's completely discussable. It's not embarrassing to say, yes, I'm really anxious, whether it's anxious about the health risks or anxious about the future of our business or anxious about the economy more broadly, right? It is absolutely acceptable and discussable to be anxious right now about these issues. So shared fear is lessened fear. Right? It's so the only silver lining here is that we are free to talk with each other, and that it's a little bit of a motivator of problem solving and innovation. I think as long as we're not completely crippled by it, people are quite motivated to try to figure out what to do to help things and to innovate.
Yeah, actually, I was talking to somebody who's on the board of a big global organisation this week. And one of the things that she was actually saying is one of the things that's kind of given her hope out of this period of time is it has encouraged all of her leaders to be more vulnerable, to open up, that there's been more transparency, so that almost some of those things that can feel particularly hard, because I think of the shared experience as you just described it, it's almost lessened the risk of doing it because we kind of all feel in it together. I think people are getting a lot of positive feedback in terms of how it's making them feel as employees. Then I kind of hope that helps to kind of propel positive momentum for continuing, because as you said, I do feel when I read about psychological safety, I feel like it's one of those areas where you will always be work in progress. You need to consistently think about it. It never goes away. I don't think there's no ticking the box.
No, you're absolutely right, because it's human nature to worry about what others think of us, and that will always be with us. And so it will always take sort of proactive effort to make that worry secondary to the worry about the mission. What we really want is for people coming to work with most of their focus, most of their ingenuity, most of their energy focused on the mission, not on the mission of looking good. That's wasteful. So it's a work in progress. It will always be with us. And what you said is exactly what I've been thinking about recently, which is, can we take this new interpersonal openness back with us into the future, right? Because I think there's more vulnerability. There's more people saying, I've got to step out right now. I've got some issues with my kids over there.
Yeah.
There's sort of all these, all this wonderful willingness to speak up about things we might not have spoken up about in the past. And can we realize that by doing so, we strengthened our bonds, we increased our humanness, and it was okay, right? So let's keep it up. Let's not go back into our personas in the future.
Yeah, and certainly none of us would wish for kind of where we are right now. But somebody was asking me this week about what gives me optimism. That's the first thing that springs to mind, is that I do think the behaviours and the mindset around psychological safety have accelerated. And that's one of those things that I really hope kind of sustains and sticks as we head into whatever kind of the next months ahead bring us. So if somebody has been listening today and thinks, wow, that's really fascinating. I'm not sure if I've got psychological safety in my organisation, or what can I do next as a leader to really kind of think about it? Where would you suggest a leader start? So if they're thinking, this has been fascinating, I buy into this, I hope I do some of this, where do you kind of suggest people kind of start in terms of, is it about getting feedback from their employees in terms of what their employees think? Is it about starting with yourself, or a bit of both?
I think it's a bit of both. So here, I would say first, look around, reflect on the last week, say, and ask yourself honestly, are you hearing mostly good news? Are you hearing, lots of thumbs up, high five, yeah, everything's going great? Or are you hearing a healthy mix of what's working and what's not working? If you're not hearing about problems or mistakes or things that aren't
Challenges,
working
yeah.
and challenges, you're definitely not getting the full story. And that may be a problem. Then look around, how energized do interactions between people seem, right? Are people kind of letting loose and just jumping in? And do you feel that energy? Do you feel a sort of healthy sense of not taking themselves too seriously, of being willing to laugh and willing to take risks? Because to a certain extent, this kind of environment is palpable, right? You sort of know it when you see it. So that's kind of step one. Another step is you can use a survey. You can do that. And then I think maybe the third best thing is to just go ask. It's a little tricky. If people are feeling unsafe,
Yeah.
they're in a bind. They're not going to say, yeah, I feel unsafe. But you can ask good questions. And this, I think, is the most powerful tool you have. And I define a good question as one that is, first, you don't know the answer to it yet, but second, it's focused on an issue that matters, a project, a timeline, a topic, and it gives people room to respond, forces thought. So you might say, I'd love to have your ideas about this project. That's a good question, right? And you do them the honor of listening to the response. So what you really want to do is, I would say, assume that psychological safety is not as high as it could be.
Yeah.
And then go about, asking and listening. Every time you ask a good question and listen thoughtfully to the response, you have given someone a little moment of psychological safety, where it's then manifested as voice and a respectful ear.
That is really useful. Just those, how you can reflect on your last week, how much you think you're getting an accurate picture versus the picture that people want you to see. How much energy are you kind of feeling, and are you start practicing asking really good questions? I think they're all really useful and relevant things that every leader could start putting into practice straight away and do more of, which is really helpful. So thank you for those. So just to finish for today, as I say, we ask all of our guests for their best piece of career advice. So it could be advice you've been given that's really stuck with you, or just your own words of wisdom that you'd like to share with everyone.
Well, I think my best piece of career advice is never pick a job for pay alone. Never pick among two options that, one you might like better, but the other pays more. Resist, because in the long run, doing what you love and what you're good at and where you can make the most contribution will lead you to the most career success. And short-term, long-term financial decisions are often misleading, right? A few more dollars this year may end up quite the opposite over the long run. So do what you love, do where you feel you can make a contribution, and trust the process to sort of keep taking you where your next stretch opportunity will be.
That's very much our mindset and attitude with all things Squiggly careers, is that, we're all going to be working for a long time. So let's enjoy it, and let's explore, let's be curious. And we talk about optimizing for learning. So just pick opportunities based on where you think you're going to learn the most. That's brilliant advice. So Amy, thank you so much for talking to us today. I feel that the work that you've done is so powerful. It has real impact in organisations. It's something when we work with any organisation, we are always talking about. So thank you for your work. We think it's amazing and we will continue to advocate for it everywhere we go, and really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me and for advocating for the work.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and thank you for listening. Though this is the final Ask the Expert episode for now, you can still listen every Tuesday to our Squiggly Careers podcast. We've now got 150 plus episodes to choose from, so hopefully no shortage of career inspiration and ideas for you. As always, you can get in touch with us via email. We're just Helen and Sarah at amazingif.com, or find us on Instagram where we're at amazingif. Thanks so much, and we'll speak to you again soon. Bye for now.